The Moriori were the first people to settle in the Chatham Islands, located 767 kilometers southeast of mainland New Zealand. For a long time, it was believed that they were of Melanesian origin. However, it's now understood that they share Polynesian ancestry with the Maori. The Moriori likely arrived from mainland New Zealand around the year 1500 AD. Over time, their culture developed independently from the Maori, forming a distinct Moriori language, mythology, artistic style, and way of life. Today, around 1,000 people identify as Moriori, though most no longer live on the Chatham Islands. Their population and society were nearly wiped out in the 1830s, when Maori groups invaded during the Musket Wars. This violent campaign, led by members of the Ngati Mutunga and Ngati Tama Iwi, resulted in what is now recognized as the Moriori genocide. During this period, most Moriori were either killed or enslaved, with around 95% of their population being lost through death or forced displacement. The Chatham Islands themselves form a remote Pacific archipelago, about 800 kilometers east of New Zealand's South Island. These islands are governed as part of New Zealand and include around 10 islands clustered within a 60-kilometer radius. The largest islands are Chatham Island and Pitt Island. The name Chatham Islands comes from the HMS Chatham, the first European ship to chart the islands in 1791. These islands sit atop the Chatham Rise, a broad underwater plateau that extends eastward from the South Island and forms part of the largely submerged continent known as Zealandia. The Chatham Islands, which rose from the ocean less than 4 million years ago, are the only parts of this geological structure that break the ocean surface. Together, Chatham Island and Pitt Island make up most of the archipelago's landmass, totaling approximately 793.87 square kilometers. The remaining land is scattered among a dozen smaller islets. The terrain is mostly hilly, and the coastlines vary with cliffs, dunes, beaches, and lagoons. Pitt Island is notably more rugged than Chatham. The highest elevation point lies on a plateau near the southern tip of Chatham Island, roughly 1.5 kilometers south of Lake Terangatapu. The interior of this plateau is dotted with lakes and lagoons, the largest being Te Wanga Lagoon, along with Hiro and Rangitahi. Streams such as Te Wainanga and Tuku run across Chatham Island, contributing to its freshwater resources. Only Chatham and Pitt Islands are inhabited. The rest are designated as conservation reserves, where access is either heavily restricted or entirely prohibited. The local economy relies mainly on agriculture, with cold water crayfish being a key export product. In recent years, tourism has also become an important economic activity for the islanders. The Chatham Islands have an oceanic climate. This means temperatures don't fluctuate wildly and rainfall is fairly common. Summers are cool and mild, with average highs between 15 and 20 degrees Celsius. Winters, particularly in July, see temperatures ranging from 5 to 10 degrees Celsius. Snowfall, however, is extremely rare. Originally, the islands were covered by a diverse mix of forests, heathlands, and swamps. Today, much of the land has been cleared for ferns or pasture, though patches of dense forest, peat bogs, and other natural habitats still remain. There are no native land mammals on the Chatham Islands. The only reptiles found here are species also native to New Zealand. Marine mammals, on the other hand, are common in the waters surrounding the islands. The Chathams are especially important as a breeding ground for large seabird colonies. Many bird species found here are endemic, including both seabirds and land-based birds that are unique to the islands. The Moriori were hunter-gatherers who lived in complete isolation on the Chatham Islands until European contact in 1791, when HMS Chatham arrived. Their ancestors had come from mainland New Zealand, sharing the same Polynesian roots as the Maori. While it is agreed that they are part of the wider Polynesian migration, the exact timing of their arrival on the islands remains uncertain. Artifacts found on Pitt Island appear to date back to the Maori Archaic period, suggesting a time before 1500 AD. However, carbon dating from other parts of the Chatham Islands consistently shows dates from after 1500 AD. Despite this, Moriori oral traditions tell a different story. According to their accounts, people already inhabited Rekohu, the Moriori name for Chatham Island when the canoe voyagers first arrived. These traditions claim that the Moriori themselves sailed directly from Polynesia to the Chatham Islands nearly 1,000 years ago, and that Maori explorers only joined them centuries later. Even though artifacts on Pitt Island hint at earlier settlement, scientific carbon dating supports a later timeline. Linguistic similarities and genealogical links with Maori communities from the South Island suggest that the Moriori settlers originally came from south of Cook Strait. The low genetic diversity among Moriori indicates that there was likely only a single arrival event, possibly involving just one canoe. Based on educated hypotheses, it may have been a trading canoe, not a war expedition, that carried men and women from the far south. That canoe may have been pushed off course as it attempted to travel northward, instead catching an ocean current that carried it east to the Chatham Islands. Archaeological findings support the idea that the Fortean they first landed on Pitt Island before later spreading to Chatham Island. In fact, the Chatham Islands were the last Pacific islands to be settled by Polynesian voyagers. Much of what is known about Moriori culture and language is uncertain, as the majority of physical and oral evidence has been lost over time. What is clear is that over the centuries, the Moriori developed a distinct and independent culture. But following the 1835 Maori invasion, their population was devastated. Many were killed outright, others died from introduced diseases, and the rest were enslaved. The remnants of Moriori language and culture became blended with Maori traditions before Europeans began documenting them. As a result, most of the information we have today about the Moriori before contact remains speculative. The Chatham Islands presented a stark contrast to the homelands of the first Polynesian settlers. The climate was colder, the environment harsher, and the local resources, though abundant, were unfamiliar. Unlike the lands they had left behind, the Chathams were unsuitable for cultivating the staple crops known across Polynesia. In response, the Moriori adapted by embracing a hunter-gatherer way of life. Their diet relied almost entirely on marine resources, including fish, fur seals, and the rich, fatty chicks of seabirds. This reliance on the ocean is confirmed by early European visitors. One observer noted that the Moriori were idle in the extreme, only seeking food when pressed by hunger, and that they subsisted largely on what the sea offered. Beached whales, porpoises, and seals were prized delicacies. Whale blubber, frequently washed ashore, was especially valued and regarded as a divine gift, evidence, in their view, of a benevolent spirit who provided for them. More crucial than their subsistence strategy, however, was the Moriori's cultural commitment to pacifism. This ethic took root partly because of the island's small size and limited resources, and the population never exceeded around 2,000 people at its peak in the 18th century. Moriori tradition centered on Nunuku's law, a belief that any violence outside narrowly defined circumstances would cause a person's bowels to rot. This cultural principle helped the community avoid the resource-draining consequences of conflict and warfare, making their fragile ecosystem more sustainable. However, this same absence of martial training left them defenseless in the 1830s, when they were attacked by armed Maori invaders from the North Island. To further regulate their numbers in a limited environment, the Moriori practiced population control. This included castrating some male infants to prevent overpopulation. Strict rules also prohibited marriages between close relatives up to third cousins, reducing the risk of inbreeding. Social organization among the Moriori was notably egalitarian by Polynesian standards. Chiefs, or iariki, were chosen based on their skills, such as fishing or bird catching, rather than hereditary status. The Moriori held strong spiritual beliefs that shaped their respectful relationship with nature. They followed a complex system of rules and rituals designed to protect and preserve their natural surroundings. These customs were deeply rooted in religious practice and were strictly followed. Even their Maori conquerors, who would later decimate the population, acknowledged the Moriori as a profoundly tapu, or reverent people. The first recorded contact between Europeans and the Moriori occurred on 29 November 1791, when the British ship HMS Chatham arrived during its voyage to the Northern Pacific. Captain William R. Broughton named the island after John Pitt, 2nd Earl of Chatham, and formally claimed it for Great Britain. When the Europeans landed, the Moriori initially withdrew into the forests, wary of the strangers. Decades later, Moriori oral traditions would remember this encounter with a mix of awe and misunderstanding. The visitors were seen as possibly divine, carriers of fire, as suggested by their smoking pipes, and female, based on the style of their clothing. It was this interpretation that convinced the Moriori men to return from the forests and meet the new arrivals. There was a moment of tension, but it quickly dissolved when the British crew placed gifts at the ends of the Moriori's spears, signaling peace. Despite this friendly gesture, attempts to trade proved unsuccessful. Later, when the crew went searching for fresh water, fears of aggression resurfaced. A miscommunication triggered violence, and one Moriori was fatally shot. Following this, HMS Chatham departed, leaving both sides troubled. Captain Broughton's diary and Moriori oral history both record a mutual sense of regret and a shared feeling of having overreacted. This early regret may have contributed to a more peaceful tone in future interactions. Between 1804 and 1807, sealers from Sydney began arriving on the Chatham Islands, and the Moriori welcomed them. News of this hospitality spread, giving the Moriori a reputation for friendliness. During this time, at least one Moriori traveled to mainland New Zealand and returned with knowledge of the Maori. As ship traffic increased, sealers began leaving crews behind for months, and the islands became a hub for both sealing and whaling activity. These newcomers competed directly with the Moriori for essential resources. The seal populations, important to the Moriori not just as food and clothing sources, but also as sacred animals, were decimated. Introduced animals and crops like pigs and potatoes altered the local diet and economy. By the mid-1830s, the Moriori population stood at around 1,600. However, between 10% and 20% of them had already died from diseases such as influenza brought in by the new visitors. Before the year 1835, a few Maori had already made their way to Rekohu, or Chatham Island, often accompanying European sealers. Some even stayed behind and settled. One such man, from the Ngati Toa tribe, established himself at Warikari, a Moriori settlement. Unfamiliar with the local language, he mistook the name of the village for that of the entire island. When he returned to New Zealand's mainland, he referred to Rekohu as Warikari, a name that has been used by Maori ever since. Then came a turning point on 19th of November 1835. A hijacked European ship, the Rodney, arrived at the Chathams, carrying around 500 Maori from the Ngati Matunga and Ngati Tama tribes. These groups had originally lived in Taranaki, on New Zealand's North Island, but had migrated to Wellington before undertaking this voyage. Their journey had been long and arduous. They were exhausted and malnourished when they landed. The Moriori, true to their tradition of hospitality, welcomed the newcomers and cared for them, helping them recover their strength. But soon the true intentions of these new arrivals became clear. Less than 3 weeks later, on the 5th of December 1835, the Rodney returned, this time with another 400 Maori aboard. Now nearly 1,000 strong, armed with muskets, clubs, and tomahawks, the Taranaki Maori began a campaign of conquest. They marched boldly through Moriori settlements without invitation, greeting, or warning. Wherever they decided to claim land, they would simply announce that the area now belonged to them and that the Moriori who lived there were their vassals. Stunned and alarmed, the Moriori elders called for a great council at Te Awapatiki. Around 1,000 men gathered to debate how to respond. Some of the younger Moriori wanted to fight back. Although they hadn't seen war for centuries, they reminded the council that they outnumbered the invaders 2-1 and could mount a defense. But the elders insisted on following Nunuku's law, a sacred tradition passed down for generations. It forbade violence and had become a core part of Moriori identity. Breaking it, they believed, would bring ruin upon them. Tragically, the decision not to resist led to catastrophe. Around 300 Moriori were killed almost immediately in acts of indiscriminate slaughter. Hundreds more were enslaved, and many of those would later die under brutal conditions. Some were murdered outright, others overwhelmed by the destruction of everything they held sacred. died of kongenge, a profound despair. One survivor later remembered how the Taranaki invaders commenced to kill us like sheep. We were terrified, fled to the bush, concealed ourselves in holes underground, and in any place to escape our enemies. It was of no avail. We were discovered and killed, men, women, and children, indiscriminately. The conquerors made no effort to hide their actions. One of them later said, "We took possession in accordance with our customs, and we caught all the people. Not one escaped." The terror did not end with the massacres. Those who survived were subjected to a new kind of slavery, one that stripped them not only of freedom, but of dignity. The Taranaki Māori forbade the speaking of the Moriori language and forced their captives to desecrate their most sacred places by defecating and urinating on them. Moriori were not allowed to marry either among themselves or with their captors. Children between Moriori partners were prohibited. This system differed greatly from traditional Maori slavery, which had more room for social integration. Still, some Moriori women bore children by their Maori masters, and a few eventually married either Maori or European men. Others were taken from the islands altogether, never to return. In 1842, a small group of Maori and their Moriori slaves migrated to the distant Auckland Islands in the sub-Antarctic, where they managed to survive for about 2 decades through sealing and flax cultivation. But by 1862, the damage was undeniable. Of an original population that once numbered around 2,000, only 101 Moriori remained alive. By sheer percentage, the Moriori genocide stands as one of the most devastating in human history. By the close of the 1860s, the remaining Moriori were no longer enslaved. This long-awaited freedom brought with it the promise of self-determination, but it also came at a time when the damage to their community was nearly irreversible. With a population devastated by war, disease, and displacement, the Moriori people faced the slow erosion of their once distinct way of life. The world they had known, guided by pacifism, intricate rituals, and deep spiritual connection to the land, had been torn apart, and now only fragments remained. In the aftermath, only a few Moriori elders still remembered the full breadth of their traditional language and customs. Their knowledge stood as a last link to the past, but they were few in number, and they were aging. The younger Moriori, though proud of their identity, had grown up speaking Maori, the language of their conquerors. They inherited the name and sense of belonging to the Moriori people, but much of the culture that had once defined their ancestors was already slipping away. There were efforts to preserve what could be salvaged. Researchers and sympathetic observers made attempts to document the language, myths, and social structures of the Moriori. But even these efforts carried with them a sense of melancholy. There was a common belief at the time that Moriori culture had passed the point of no return, that it would never again be a fully living tradition. This belief shaped how their stories were collected, more as historical relics than as part of a culture that might continue and evolve. By the turn of the 20th century, the Moriori presence on the Chatham Islands had dwindled to near invisibility. Just 12 individuals identified themselves as Moriori. The community had not disappeared entirely, but it had been diluted through intermarriage, cultural suppression, and the passing of generations. The last known Moriori of unmixed ancestry, Tommy Solomon, died in 1933. His death was seen by many as the symbolic end of the Moriori people as they had once been. Yet, the story did not end there. While the bloodlines had blended, identity proved more resilient. Descendants of the Moriori, though of mixed heritage, continued to claim and embrace their ancestry. They kept alive the memory of who they were, and over time, efforts to revive and celebrate Moriori culture began to take root. At the beginning of the 21st century, official recognition of Moriori identity began to emerge in statistical terms. In the 2001 New Zealand census, 585 people identified as Moriori. 5 years later, in 2006, that number had grown to 942. While the population declined slightly to 738 in the 2013 census, by 2018, it had risen again to 996. These numbers, while small, point to a reawakening of identity and belonging among those who trace their lineage to the Chatham Islands.